Hello, and welcome to my presentation. My name is Bridget Hale, and today I will be guiding you through my data visual regarding influenza season in the United States. As an up-and-coming data analyst, I've taken a deep dive into the topic of influenza outbreaks in the U.S. from 2009 to 2017. As we walk through this presentation, I'd like to highlight the issue at hand while we focus on statistics provided by the CDC in order to offer viable solutions for the upcoming flu season. What and why are we trying to convey? There has been an influx of ILI cases, or influenza-like illness cases, particularly in areas where large amounts of elderly people live. This will be our primary focus as to where temporary medical staff and aides should be deployed to prepare for the upcoming flu season. Throughout the year, January across the board yields the highest amount of ILI cases and deaths. To highlight that point, I created a bar chart of total flu deaths for every January between 2009 and 2017. Here we can see 2009 produced the most amount of deaths in the U.S. with 6,568 cases, with the lowest amount of deaths in January of 2012 with 6,067 cases, and a steady uptick in more recent years. Next, I created a histogram showcasing deaths by age groups of increments of 10. The darker colors represent the more vulnerable populations. Here we can see darker blues represent our older populations, vulnerable deaths. So who are the vulnerable, and how much of the death rate do they account for? Here I've depicted both a tree map and a pie chart. The tree map amplifies the where of the problem, and the pie chart explains the who. Here in the tree map, we can see that California, New York, Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio are home to the majority of vulnerable deaths. In the pie chart, we can see the vulnerable population accounts for nearly 2/3 of total flu deaths. This was a total number of 6,557,944 deaths. Vulnerable population accounted for over 400,000 of those. Next, we see a stacked bar chart broken down by death rate by state and categorized into either vulnerable, which we consider anyone 65 years and older, versus non-vulnerable populations. California makes up the largest value of deaths in both vulnerable and non-vulnerable. And here we can see my home state of Florida, unfortunately, is not too far behind. Here we find a visual where I further refine the values into months of our most recent year, 2017, along with number of deaths per age group. Again, the darker shades of blue represent the more vulnerable groups. Here we see January of 2017 accounted for 1,856 vulnerable deaths. And we can get that number by adding the 3 age groups that make up the vulnerable population to give us 1,856 deaths. I wanted to show the correlation between vulnerable population and deaths. Here my scatter plot demonstrates a strong correlation between the two. While we do see a couple of outliers, the majority of clusters of our dots follow the trend line. Here we see we have an R squared value of 0.884199, which will give us a correlation coefficient of 0.94. Very strong. Here, U.S. maps of vulnerable population versus vulnerable deaths. The darker states represent the higher population of vulnerable people. We can see in the first map that California, New York, and Texas are the most densely populated states with vulnerable population. Now below, we see the size of the star representing the value of vulnerable deaths. The larger the star, the more vulnerable deaths. And again, the darker the state, the more densely populated it is by vulnerable individuals. Here we broaden our scope from state to region. The 5 U.S. regions over the course of 8 years depict an understanding of which location, region-wise, is most in need. Here we see a downward trend in the Southwest with 19,634 deaths in 2009, down to 15,231 deaths in 2017. Alternatively, although the West has the least amount of deaths by region, 8,177 back in 2009, we see the biggest uptick in deaths with 10,546 cases in 2017. Finally, we can see the Southeast region is responsible for the most amount of flu deaths overall, peaking in 2013 with a whopping 22,165 deaths. So that we may be able to offer solutions, let's take a peek into the future. Here we see our regional line graph, but this time we've added in our forecast feature. This creates a projection of what we can expect for the next coming years. Here I've forecasted 5 years into the future. What it shows us is relatively good news. The majority of the regions are projected to hold steadily, with the exception of western states, with an expected jump of another 2,000 deaths. We can also see the Southeast is still projected to have the highest amount of deaths, with an estimated account of over 21,000 deaths. Crucial next moves. Our findings show California, New York, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Florida lead the charge with highest mortality rates for ILI cases and deaths, as well as being most densely populated with vulnerable people. This solidifies our hypothesis of the need for more attention in more vulnerable populous areas as they produce the most amount of flu deaths. There is a strong need for deploying medical staff, facilities, and aid to those states, as well as focusing on southeastern and western regions, particularly in the month of January. I hope this presentation was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time. Thank you.